Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us today, and we have a very important topic and very highly esteemed presenters who I'm very excited to have with us. I'll introduce them briefly. Um, we have Dr. Doris Schopper, who's coming to us from the medical faculty and is also the director of the Center for Education and Research in Humanitarian Action. She's a former chair of, I'm going to say Doctors Without Borders, so that I don't embarrass you with my French accent, of the Ethics Review Board, actually, at the University of Geneva. And Dr. Ramin Asghari, who's here with us at George Washington University. He's a professor in the Department of Global Health, but he also has widespread field experience and experience. They both have experience in uh, areas of conflict and humanitarian crisis and have faced real world research ethics dilemmas. And we are going to learn a lot from them today as we face more and more challenges around the world. Um, this is what we're going to do. These are the opening remarks. We're going to have panelist presentations next. Dr. Asghari will go second. Dr. Schopper will go first. And then we're going to do a Q&A. Thank you all for sending in the topics you'd like to speak about and some introductory questions in advance. We'll also take questions, Q&A from all of our attendees. Please just put them in the chat and we'll try to get as many of you in as possible. And then we'll have some closing remarks by the panelists. So again, thank you all for coming. We have many, many, many. Right now we have 120 participants and I expect that that will grow over the time period. Thanks to Asghari, Dr. Asghari and Dr. Schopper ahead of time. And Dr. Schopper, please let us know whenever you're ready. And are you sharing your slides or is you are? All right. So
I'm showing slides. I just wait for the share. It's here. Okay.
Okay, I will stop my share now and then I will restart later.
Okay. Here we go. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, everybody. I'm talking, as Professor Goldstein just mentioned, I'm talking a lot from the perspective of having led for many years the Ethics Review Board of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and having worked myself for quite a number of years in humanitarian settings. So this is where I'm coming from. Sorry. Now, the question is even, why should we worry about research ethics? I guess for many of you, that's obvious, but as it applies in any type of research involving humans, it is even more so in humanitarian settings. Here are the reasons everybody would agree why we have to have independent review of research. It's about the research potential conflicts. It's that the research is not exploitative, that dignity, rights, and safety of participants are accounted for. And then, of course, most journals nowadays will not publish if you haven't had ethics reviews. This, to me, is the minor reason for doing it, but it may backfire if you don't do it. Now, but what is more important is what is special in humanitarian settings. Of course, people are much more vulnerable than under normal circumstances. Usually the local standards of care are poor, or at least much poorer than in the US or in Europe. And the duty to provide care from a humanitarian organization may conflict with research priorities. Sometimes it's the same organization providing care and doing research. Sometimes, of course, that can be different institutions, but there may still be this conflict between providing care and doing research at the same time. The other thing is that very often research carried out under these circumstances involves several institutions, and it certainly involves often institutions more from the north, together with institutions from the south, or from different countries from the south. So you may have to account for the fact that you have multiple interests in there. The local research oversight, you have ethics committees now, I think, in all countries, but sometimes these are weak, or are politicized, so you can't be sure that the local ethics committee really accounts for everything we would like to make sure before we start a research. And then local research infrastructure may be very depleted, of course, or even unavailable. I mean, this is obviously a photo from an African country. I could have put a photo now from Gaza. Médecins Sans Frontières right now is carrying out research in Gaza. So you can just imagine what this means for carrying out research in such a context where it's not only research infrastructure, but all infrastructure really, which is seriously depleted. Now, there are some baseline assumptions when you do research in disaster situations in humanitarian settings. Very often, depending on how much it is an emergency situation in which you work, it needs to be initiated quickly to be meaningful. An example is Ebola. When we had the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the research needed to start very quickly to be in any way meaningful. But of course, there was a big tension between providing care to the patients and carrying out the research. When you do it in post-emergency situations, it may be a little bit less the time pressure, but anyway, you must submit it to ethical scrutiny in both cases. It's the same ethical principles that apply. There is nothing new about it, but they must be applied in an even more stringent way than you would do it in a research setting in a stable context. It must be timely and flexible, of course, and the important criteria to judge the ethics of disaster research is it relevant for the population which you will subject to the research? If you can do that research somewhere else, do it somewhere else. Don't do it in that situation. Be very clear about potential additional harm or suffering due to the research. This is always important, but it's even more important as these people are already subjected to much more suffering than in stable conditions. Two big issues in those situations is political pressure to do the research and the humanitarian misconception. And I'm quickly coming back to what the humanitarian misconception is and how we can deal with it. And then it's, of course, the feasibility of the research, which is very important to look at before you even start thinking about the research. Now, what do we know internationally about the rules for carrying out research in these situations? Now, there is no international regulation, but some of the existing guidelines or bodies who have looked at this have specific parts of their guidelines which address this. The most well-known and most important one for you to know if ever you consider this are clearly the CIOMS guidelines that were reviewed. The last revision dates from 2016, and they have a specific guideline on research in disasters and disease outbreaks. There's the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is very highly respected. They also made a new publication in 2020, which is worthwhile looking at. In 2010, it was interesting. During a public health emergency in Canada, there was a framework proposed for ethics review during such an emergency. And then at the Ethics Review Board of Médecins Sans Frontières, we published a first paper in 2009 after 7 years of experience with doing this in emergency and humanitarian situations. So I just want briefly to say what were the particulars that we established, which may be useful for any of you who consider doing this research to look at while looking at the ethics of this research. Just for those who are not familiar with Médecins Sans Frontières, it's the largest non-profit organization providing healthcare in humanitarian settings. You see some of the data here. And so people often don't know that Médecins Sans Frontières has increasingly been doing research since the 1990s, epidemiological research, medical research, public health research. So MSF said, we have concerns which are distinct from academic institutions. Often you have research would be submitted to a university ethics review board, but that is they don't know what humanitarian situations are about most of the same time. Then the ethics committees in the countries where MSF works often don't have good or not functional ethics committees. And then the local and national government is often not a guarantor for the well-being of the population, obviously. So that is why MSF decided in 2002 to establish its own ethics review board. To my knowledge, this was the first ever ethics review board of a non-governmental governmental organization that was established for research purpose. Obviously, organizations such as WHO have their own ethics review board. As I said, many academic institutions have, but this was very something new. And what is interesting, and which over the years I saw the benefit of, is that this ethics review board is totally independent of the organization. The members of the board are all volunteers. You see the variety of professionals, geographic varieties, etc., which are part of the board. And we cannot work with MSF, and we cannot be member of a board of MSF while we're members of the ethics review board, to really guarantee that there can be no conflict of interest. And this has been extremely valuable, because ethics review often raises issues and raises difficult issues, and to convey those to the researchers, being able to say that there is absolutely only thing for us is the interest of the research, the people who will be participants in the research. That's the only thing which is of interest to us. We also, after a number of years, when we started doing this, we created our own framework for reviewing this research, because the things that were available internationally for us were not practical enough. So it was difficult for MSF researchers to really understand what you mean, by beneficence, do no harm, etc. It's clear, but how do you apply it in a situation? So we derived them from international guidelines and ethical theory, but they're very practical benchmarks, and it just makes explicit and systematic what we ask for. So for the reviewers and for the people doing the research in MSF, it is very clear what is being evaluated under which terms. And it really narrowed the scope for disagreement and made the applications much better. This is absolutely publicly available. We published one article saying what our experience was with this framework, and it's available on the website I have mentioned here. Another thing which for us was very important to say, it depends on the potential harm of a research, how stringent the review has to be. Doesn't mean you don't review, but we found different ways of reviewing depending. And you see here, it goes from retrospective analysis of routinely collected clinical data, which MSF has tons of, to clinical trials. So you have really the whole gamut of research. And as you go up from here to here, the potential harm increases. So we devised, and I'm happy to talk more about that, but some of this research has been approved a priori. We have standard protocols for morbidity, mortality, and nutrition surveys, and some of it, of course, when it comes to clinical trials, it's a very stringent review we do. Then there is the real issue of emergency research, meaning something happens today and you want to do research within the next 2 weeks. This happens sometimes in epidemics. This can also happen in a disaster situation. And what we have tried to do is to say, well, if you want to do research for the next Ebola epidemic, perhaps you can think about what you want to do now and propose a generic research protocol, which we can already approve, and then you can adapt it very quickly in case of the emergency, and we can accept it very quickly. This has worked sometimes. It's difficult, but based on the Ebola experience, we published an article looking at how you can do these very timely and very quick reviews. It was a challenge, I can tell you, but it was done. Just to show that research in MSF is alive, since we started in 2002 until now, it has increased enormously, the number of research submitted to the Ethics Review Board. And not all research is submitted, because some things have been approved a priori. So it's not even everything which MSF does. And so this is just to give a little bit of sense. And as research increased, the number of ERB members also increased over time. There are some issues which need really particular vigilance. I'm looking at the time, still a few minutes. I cannot go over all of these. I'm happy to dig into one or two things more if it's needed. I just want to quickly say a few words about 3 of them. One which has been a burning issue since we started the ERB in 2002 is how do you involve the community? And it's very complicated because what is the community in these places? Who is it? And community leaders may not be the community, and they may have different interests than research participants. So it is really all these questions you see here are extremely important to think about before you start the research. So you need to spell it out very clearly in your protocol how you will involve the community, who the community is, and also how you will report the results back to the community and to research participants at the end. In context where this may not be easy, but you need to figure out how to do it. Informed consent is an ever-burning issue because having informed consent procedures which really allow participants to understand what this is about, and don't put in the informed consent and we'll do a randomized controlled trial. Well, what does that mean? You need to explain this. So it must be culturally, linguistically appropriate. It needs, of course, to be pre-tested, etc. And you need perhaps to do some schooling on the research, which will you be doing in the community before you even start. And absolutely essential that people really feel free to refuse or to withdraw, and don't confuse this with not getting access to drugs. And that's where the humanitarian and therapeutic misconception comes in. It is very difficult for people to understand that they will get care, regardless if they participate or not, that this is not equaling care, and that they can really make a decision. Of course, sometimes you can feel that you get better care because you participate in the research, or if you don't. And it is also quite interesting when you look at something like outbreaks, the hemorrhagic fever outbreaks we had in many East African countries. There was a lot of published research, and ethics review at that time was only mentioned in 3 cases. I hope this will not be the case now anymore, and you had more scientists on the spot than people to provide patient care. And this was a big battle we had during the Ebola outbreaks to always make sure that patient care comes first and that only then you start doing research. You can think about it, but you do it only once you have the care in place. So very briefly, the recommendations I would have to those who consider this is, first of all, to be very clear of the boundaries between research and what the medical or public health intervention is. If possible, if you know already you want to do research in a certain setting or on a certain topic to do it before the event happens, to involve communities beforehand if that's possible, and certainly to decide what care needs to be in place before you can start research, to be sure that care always has priority over research activities. And to engage with national committees. Humanitarian organizations are in places for a long time. It's not that they haven't been there before. They can engage with national committees well beforehand, discuss with them, see, what the different perceptions may be, etc. To have a rapid procedure for approval. It's very good that everything can happen electronically. I think the times where ERBs met physically is probably gone in many places now, and that's good. We have always worked virtually, and it works very well. And the final thing is to be very clear that you don't oversample affected populations. When there is something happening and something big and everybody wants to do research and everybody comes and people come again and again, so you need to have a mechanism, either a coordination mechanism or one organization which has the oversight to avoid that this is happening. This has even happened within MSF, between different MSF quarters, so one needs to be very careful about this. This is it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Schapper. Dr. Asghari, do you have slides?
Sure. If you just let me share it, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right, maybe we could go here. All right. Thank you, Joris. Thank you so much for really kind of touching on the major points. I appreciate your presentation. My position is going to be a little bit of, challenging some of the thinkings that we have. And I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just challenging some of the thinking process that we have. First, I just wanted to give an idea about what we mean when we say humanitarian situation. because I think, people could have different understandings. So maybe for 2 or 3 minutes, I can give you some examples and I kind of walk you through some of the images. So some of the definitions are different, but I guess, this is the one that perhaps is accepted. So there has to be really critical and serious threats to the health, security, and safety, livelihood, and well-being of the community or large group of people. Often it happens on the backdrop of the situation that already they have a lot of, limitation in terms of social capital and health resources. There's going to be multiple reasons for these humanitarian situations. And what happens, I think, I want you to think about that there's going to be significant disruption in all social governance and health structures. So we're not talking about only the health, we're talking about everything else that is going to support any kind of health interventions. Therefore, people usually need some kind of external support, whether it's going to be within their own countries or something around, but it's going to be outside their community. And there's a difference between the global health setting, I think, and this is just my definition or understanding of it, and humanitarian setting is that even if you are, let's just say, working in some, rural area or villages in Kenya, and it's not a humanitarian setting, you still have some infrastructures in terms of social and health that they are working. They're not great, but they are there. The problem with a humanitarian setting is that those are disrupted. So your education, your commerce, your security, your shelter, your governance, your food supplies, and all in all is going to be disrupted. And that's the reason for significant, obviously, challenges that you face. And you got to remember that humanitarian settings, by its nature and definition, is depleted from a lot of resources. There's going to be a lot of shortcomings. So you got to be able to deal with that and understand that context. So I'm going to take you to some of the examples of what are the security context. So this is basically a refugee camp in Darfur or displaced population, and there's a lot of shooting. So here's I'm in the bunker room, and all you hear is a shooting. So this is how 40,000 people live with no electricity in the middle of nowhere. So all you can hear is just shootings, and this happens a couple of times a week. Going on, and then tomorrow morning. So here is the local population that obviously they are coming to the the location of an NGO. This is again in Darfur, and this is MSF project that are asking for us to advocate on their behalf, and talking about the security issues that they want on a daily basis. This is the usual refugee displaced population camp. So think about the privacy that could have in this context of the families. They live in these huts. And this has been, this is from 2008, so it has been there for 3 to 4 years. Again, thinking about the health, context, this is the hospital, this is a ward for, women's and children. This is all, everything that you could get and expect in terms of either the privacy or support that you have. This is an example of the people displaced in Haiti after the earthquake. This is at the side of the highways, and people live in these huts for a long period of time with no security, no privacy in any form. This is the basically wards within the General Hospital, which is the main hospital in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and that's where the patients are, and people have access all the time, coming and going. This is an ICU in the General Hospital. This is unfortunately an individual who didn't have any information, no name, nothing, was brought in, died, and has been waiting in that bed in the ICU, and the rest of the individuals are, on the beds around them for 15 to 16 hours in order to be picked up and to be taken to the morgue, with no one really having. I also want to give you a sense of what's the practice norm when you practice medicine. This is the border of Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, that you see this individual as the patient, and in all, and then here's the doctor. And all of these individuals, they have nothing to do with this patient. They're not their relative. They're just other patients waiting to be seen, but they are in the private office and exam room and trying to help, or just there. And this is the degree of the privacy or that you can get in the practice. And this is what the culturally it seems to be appropriate. If the woman really needs something that is very sensitive, usually she comes with a bunch of other women and asks everybody else to stay out, and they try to help her to get care. This is in a refugee camp, again, in Bangladesh, in Rohingyas, and this is the amount of the care that you have and the privacy and the support that you get in the field hospital. I also want to touch on the data in humanitarian situations. So this is usually a type of the data registration that you get. It's a bunch of the name of the people and basic information on a booklet that usually is not secured in any specific places and is accessible all the time. And if there's really any, legible data, is going to be at best looking like this, which you can see it's not neither legible nor actually is correct numbering. And so let me go back to what we are here to talk about outside the context. So I think, I'm going to talk about some of the philosophical and practical consideration. We have to note that there are differences in values, experience, and expectations. And I have two experiences for some reason there. In most of the contexts, we really have no idea what the important ethical values are from the perspective of the recipient of aid. And I think that's really a biggest failure, a gap in our data. We actually don't know what people think is important and what people think is ethical and or non-ethical in different contexts. And so somehow we end up imposing, not intentionally, obviously, and unidirectionally the values that we have. And just to be provocative, I put there privacy, autonomy, or individual benefits. You have to think about that. Sometimes people have looking for a collective gain that the community has, as opposed to the individual gain that they have, and are willing to participate in either the research or, I think in most humanitarian situations, we end up having a program evaluations, and so that's a different talk. And perhaps not, except the examples that Doris had in Ebola, we probably don't end up really actually having very active research in a very acute phase of humanitarian situations. We know the data is lacking. I think that's where we really have to emphasize. There are people, participants, that could talk about this, today more than what I can. Also, I want to talk about the consent. We do, I think, have some tension between understanding of a community consent with some of the procedures, especially if there are really biological samples of all of those things versus the individual consent. And then what are the really local experience and understanding and the differences? And I think, I put it cultural versus contextual experiences, because sometimes we put a name of the culture into it, but the reality is that because of the resources and they have, and because the way that they develop different coping strategy in order to really understand and value different gains that the community as a whole could have, they could actually have a different priorities in terms of how the research should be done. I think, a lot of time that we work in academia, this is just a criticizing our approach, I think, in a way, and then working with our NGOs or other service providers, that their consent form seems to be almost like irrelevant to the most subjects in a humanitarian situation or global health for that reason. And you take people through the really large number of the questions. If this happened, you can do this one. If there's something happened, you will be referred to that one. And we all know that most of those are probably people don't understand it, don't even care about it. And it takes time and energy. And a lot of time in this type of situation, when people are distressed, they're really actually basically willing to really give a lot for the better good of the community or the population at large. And they basically say, well, whatever everyone else says, I'm going to go with it. And I think, the way that you have to think about it is that how we can differentiate between the collective versus individual goal. And if people are actually willing or want to pay for the consequences that they could actually have in participating in research because they know it's going to be good for their community. This is how they grew up with it. Everybody decides for you and you decide for other people. You're a religious leader. Sometimes they make a good decision, sometimes they make a bad decision. The community leaders, we have no idea if they are representative or not. We don't even know they should be representative or not. I don't think we should even really prescribe anything. It's got like you are there for 5 or 6 years anyway. And then I want you to think about these things. Let me just see what the timing, I don't know. It's like, okay, maybe 5 minutes. Privacy, there's really no privacy in most of the situation, even in the community itself. I'm gonna give you an example. People really take pictures and put it in the social media, the office visits or the patient care or daily life. And then you show up as a researcher and you have 3 pages of consent and you're talking about all of those things. Yeah, and so the question is it meaningful? It could be absolutely, yes, there's going to be some risk reduction. And the question is, how much is the risk reduction is that? And then let's talk about the risk to the subject. So, I have been, involved in many decision-making regarding some of the research projects, especially when it comes to like children and then trauma or, vulnerable population. And there's really emphasis that you don't want to ask questions in order to re-traumatize the kids, and often in that context, it's just they're on a daily basis are traumatized. Forget about the re-traumatizations, and that there's no data. And then if you want to develop a good service, you're supposed to have a data. So how do you balance the risk? A lot of time we don't even know what's that re-exposure risk is in terms of the actual risk, the absolute risk, and how do you balance the risks of that and having no data and then stopping a project because you don't want to re-traumatize, and then there's absolutely no data and they continue to be at risk. So the questions are, if we agree with the community values or contextual values, and if not, how we can really bring them together. And then we talked about representation. I think Doris talked about it. And then also you got to really think about what is the community. I use it and everybody uses it. I don't know really in most contexts what it means. Is it statutory? Is it like geographically? And are they all the same? No. So this is my last slide. I think I have 2 more minutes. So now I'm going to talk about the IRB processes, and I think Doris, you touched about a little bit, and then had some direction, and then we can go and read some of the papers that you worked on it and your colleagues. I think we always say that IRB process either in the U.S. by the way or outside the U.S. Or in the global setting, say, well, let's have a community representation. And so the question is that how do we decide who is the representation? Are we okay with that or not? But I'm going to go back to the local IRB. So, we obviously require a lot of, research projects to have local IRBs. And my question really is that that's the burden really that we impose it, to be honest with you. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not saying not doing it. I'm just talking about some of the challenges. Most of them are going to be either to the Ministry of Health or university. They are not supported. They are not paid. They don't have funding in order to allocate to that. And that's why you ended up being in this long process of decision making. And at the end, someone just read them, and then become the Ministry of A or Boo and, B and say, okay, I sign off on it. And the question is is it meaningful? Is it, supporting something? And then I think I've noticed that the purpose of IRB committees have changed over time a little bit. It has changed over time. And then so the question is that whose risks are we going to protect? It seems that we're transitioning to the using the IRB process in order to avert institutional risks, and they might not be in the same direction. The institution, I think Doris, you talked about the different institutions. And then I think I'm going to throw in there an accountability, because I think a lot of times we mix, ethics with accountability, and that's the distinction that we have to work on it. IRB processes are being very cumbersome. Anyone who works in a global health knows that. And so the question is that where is the emphasis, and where is that that kind of balance that it could be more practical and not really focusing on organizational risk or in the expense of really putting a lot of burden. I apologize. This is my last slide. So I'm going to also touch on the data risk management. Obviously, I think that seems domestically sounds great that, if we have resources that we have this data privacy and risk management units that helps us, although I can tell you it's cumbersome too. But remember, whenever you have experts in security, you're going to identify a lot of security problems. and then you're going to take less and less risks. But the humanitarian context, because of the lack of data and because of the threshold and the lack of buffer zone, it really actually is full of risk, and you need to take the risk. Now, how do you balance that? And, usually I think it ends up being not doing anything. And so I think that's not good for the context. And so I have some example. I'm not going to go through them. I apologize for that. And I want to tell you, everything is going to cost. Every layer of a security, IRB restriction, or you want to do something better, you got to put time, energy, money, and HR into it. And that means you got to take it from somewhere else and put it here. You better be sure that you actually identified and balanced these two risks together. So I wrote here, everything is a barrier for the poor, including assuring their ethical support and research ethics in the name of good moral standing. Don't be the last sentence. Can we find a balance? And then, have some example how we can improve it. And I want to say that this is the same problem that we have with working with the underserved community in the US. I'm going to stop here. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much to you both. You have raised many, many questions for us, as you can see in the chat. I thought I would share, start first with one of the questions that were submitted beforehand. And in general, several people brought up the idea of emerging technologies and whether they might hurt or make no difference or actually help in these situations. Dr. Asghari, you mentioned the privacy issues with posting on social media. I'm not sure that's helping anything unless it's bringing awareness to problems, which could be considered possibly helping. But I'm wondering on both of you, if you could comment on the idea of emerging technologies.
Doris, you want to go first?
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Perhaps for the sake of time, I can quickly answer that and one or two other questions. Some of them I answered already in writing, so I hope people can still see them. It depends what you mean by emerging technologies. A lot of things are emerging. A lot of new medical devices and medical engineering is also emerging. So I think the question is extremely broad. You probably think more about, AI and social media and things like that. Now, what of that will be useful, not be useful? What I would also say is that research has to be done to explore how these things can be useful for public health, for medical purpose, and particularly in humanitarian settings. And that is something which clearly MSF is doing. Somebody asked, are we doing, as MSF, doing other things than just evaluations? Of course, this is research. Often it's research into new technologies, which MSF does, but new technology which supposedly could have a beneficial effect for the people affected. Now, the whole issue of social media, mobile phones, etc., they can be very useful, but of course they can be detrimental, but they can be as much there as they are in our everyday lives. So I don't know what particular thing you had in mind there. But for example, mobile phones have been very useful for research purposes. Interviews have been carried out of our mobile phones. Of course, you need to be very careful that you can guarantee safety, privacy, etc. So that raises a lot of questions to do that. It's different than doing it in writing, interviewing a person at home, but it can also have advantages. So this every time has just to be thought through very carefully to know, is it in favor of the participant, or could it potentially harm the participant in the way we always do it? So I think that would be about the same, I would say. Thank you.
Dr. Asghari?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, it's very context-based in terms of using technology. I think in general, in terms of data collection, probably is going to be better in terms of privacy and security, comparing to the papers and all of those things. And then you can build into it also to decrease the measurement error. So I think there's a lot of kind of like, both in terms of rigor of the research and the privacy that you can use. But everything is so context-based, as Doris says, every single, research has to be really, it's so much of a time and also context-based. Something that it might not be feasible today might be very feasible and actually okay 5 years from now, or it was 5 years before. So it has to be a discussion of all of the stakeholders at the time for that specific project.
Okay, all right, thank you. Dr. Schupper, you mentioned that you wanted to answer some of the ones in the Q&A, or that you had already answered a few.
Some I have answered in writing, so I hope other people could see them. There are just two more I could quickly answer. There's one question: is there a situation where ethical review can be skipped? And that is very important. No, it cannot be skipped if it is research, but you can have mechanisms which allows the researchers to have an a priori approval, which is, for example, as I said, which we did with MSF for mortality, morbidity surveys, nutrition surveys, which MSF does all the time. So there was no sense in us receiving over and over the same protocols, just in different contexts. So we have generic protocols, and people are responsible in MSF for adapting them to a local situation, safeguarding, of course, the participants. So you can do things like that, but it doesn't mean that you have skipped a review. You have just changed the mode of the review to adapt it to a situation. But as I was showing, the more risky the research becomes, the more stringent the review needs to be. So I wouldn't say skipping. I would say you can adapt your ethics review mechanisms. And somebody else was asking what type of MSF research does. I gave the web link to the science portal. Now, when you go on there, you see all the publications which come out of MSF research, and you see the very vast array of different types of research MSF is doing. But it's all about improving care and health of people MSF is serving. So it can be absolutely new treatments, it can be new technologies being used, it can be in an epidemic, just getting a sense of where the epidemic goes. So it can be very different things. So I just encourage you to go and look on the science portal of MSF and get a sense of the type of research. I hope I answered some of the things that were there.
You did, thank you. I do want to point out one of the questions in the chat by Mirgissa Kaba, and the question is, it reflects some of the ideas in the questions that were submitted beforehand as also. With community engaged in definition of problems, research questions, as well as general approaches, how would IRB and the ethical clearance process should be handled? So to me, this raises the idea of community, what is good, what is harm to community versus the individuals, and working them in, which can be quite resource intensive, both time and people resources. So I'd like both of your, Dr. Esby, you both spoke about this a little bit, but I'd like for you to expand a little more.
Sure, maybe I can go on. I mean, I think the understanding of the question that I have is that how we can ensure that the research questions are something that the community has interest in it. Is that what I understand correctly from her? I think so again, let's play the devil's advocate. So when you show up in a place to provide humanitarian services, and I'm thinking about program evaluation in this case, there are criteria that you showed up there. So there are things that you need to address. And there are moments that the community priorities are not necessarily aligned with your priorities. And the reason for that are enormous, either because, they don't understand and they don't have a background or to understand and what epidemic of A and B could cause. They have never really dealt with it and they don't have understanding of that. That is where you are there. Or because they are in this situation of the fear or lack of resources, and for them, maybe, different type of food is probably the priority. So you really have to kind of work that. It's not that what the community says, you just say, sure, I got to do that. That's not going to happen. This is the work between the stakeholders, and each stakeholder in this intersection has got expertise and has got really points to bring into. So I think, yes, identifying as much as you can who are the potential, representation that you could get from the community, and start talking about why is it that you are here? Why is it that you provide this research? And then bringing down to the level that they understand it. And in most case scenarios, unless it's like very, very kind of charged issues, then they're going to come along. And because you're there to help them. And then you also have to basically sometimes allow for providing some kind of support, and that could be the research that they are interested, that you don't think is in the top 5 priorities, but it gets the buying in from the community, because that's how you create trust. And so I think that's a very interactive ongoing discussion. And I think you have to be transparent about the things, the reasons that you are there. And there are things that you definitely have to do. And there are things that you cannot do either because you don't have expertise. It's not going to be meaningful. And also allow yourself to really accept that there are things that you don't know and they want to, and they care for it and it's very important for them. And you don't think that's important. It's an ongoing and interactive discussion. And I don't know if Doris, you want to go. There are some other questions I can come back to.
Yeah, perhaps you said a lot on that topic. I mean, there is another community somebody asked a question about, which are the national and local scientists, not only social scientists, but I would say scientists overall. And would they know more about the community, etc.? Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I think the onus on any organization coming in from the outside, let it be MSF or an academic institution or wherever, you have a duty to involve local scientists in your research, and you should, if needed, build local capacity or help in building local capacity by involving people and allowing them to get more training through the research. So I think that is very important. Yes, sometimes people know the communities better. I have also seen examples where MSF, it was my case when I did research in northern Uganda. While somebody from Kampala didn't know these communities in northern Uganda, they felt more foreign to them than we who had been living there for months. So it was very interesting to see how being national scientists doesn't necessarily mean that you know the local community extremely well. But of course, it can often, and it's very important. And generally, it would not be acceptable to except for very specific political situations do the research without having a collaboration with national or local scientists. Something else which was important because I did not have time to address it, but is pathogen and benefit sharing. It's also data sharing. It's everything. What do you do with the things you collect? And how are people getting access to benefits? That is absolutely essential, ethically speaking, in any research we are looking at. Now, I would say the privilege in an organization like MSF is that MSF at the same time is providing services as it is doing research. When an academic institution comes in, often they do not provide services afterwards. So MSF has a real onus on making sure that whatever positive comes out of the research is made accessible to the population. But in general, I think that is an onus on the researchers. We have, of course, a huge issue nowadays with data sharing, pathogen sharing, DNA sharing, and these has been a huge issue after the Ebola epidemic and so forth. The first thing to say is that participants in a research should upfront give consent to further use of whatever they are giving. And often that is not thought about. It's very complicated to do it after the fact. And you should not be allowed to use, in particularly body samples, after the fact if people have not given their consent. So think about it up front and get consent. And if you don't get consent, you're not allowed to use it. So that would be my brief answer to that question.
Maybe I can piggyback on what Doris said. Well, so an example in MSF that we tried to do the same thing. We had a big project in 20,000 population doing cervical cancer. We were trying to get the consent beforehand in terms of using the images of the cervix and all of those things. So both for the, obviously improving the program and assessing, evaluating the program, and also, distributing the knowledge that would be useful for someone else. Other contexts. And I can tell you that it took us 9 months, even with MSF, to really get the actual consent really accepted to the level. And it went through a lot of layers and the data security management, they showed up, and it was just insane amount of really time and energy in order to get that done. And the thing at the end, I think we did it, and it's useful, and it could be the basis for many other projects. But the question always here is that when you work in the context of humanitarian agencies, the time, the human resources are going to be an expense of a bunch of other services, and I want everyone to be conscious about it. I'm going to piggyback to the question that David Curry had, and basically said, with all of these challenges, how are you going to actually go there? And you probably better not to do it. I'm not saying that's what you said. So I think is that if there are problems, in a way, it gives you an opportunity to solve. B is that humanitarian context, it is a place that there's a lot of problems. The only good thing is that then you can one by one solve them. And then I think that's the aim is, and as opposed to get discouraged. So I think most people will end up working in this context, they accept that so there's always going to be a room that we will improve. And so I believe in that. So I think we can work on that. B is that we really need data. We really don't have enough data, and then that means that a lot of resources that we put into programs, we actually, we're not sure they're going to work or not. So we really need good and regular data. It has to be balanced again between how much we resource will put into it. Let me give you an example. If I really want to like print something, and if I want to really get another research assistant to be a part of a project in order to make sure that people understand, if after the consent or during the procedure something happened to them so they can access this and that one, that would be maybe, I don't know, $4,000 a year or something. And then, I can buy a malaria, test for $1 or less than $1. And so, from the perspective of an NGO, you got to figure that out. So that's not an easy thing to do, but certainly there are a lot of places that you can, improve something. And so I think that's where you go. And then I think another question here is that how do you build trust? And now I go back again to what I said is that transparency is extremely important. You got to be clear is that why you are there and why is it that you are doing research and trying to work with people and try to help them kind of like get on board. And sometimes during this process, you understand, well, actually they're right. Maybe that's not the biggest problem. And sometimes this process, they understand, oh, okay, we are with you. So I think constant reiteration, direct communication with the individual beneficiaries, try to include as much as a stakeholder and revisit, and then be open and listen. There's a lot of power in listening, and then you can incorporate. At the end of the day, again, as I said, there's always room to do better. It's just because everything is such a bottom of every potential resources.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more answer. And I wanted to bring up an idea from the questions we got in advance. The person asked, please discuss cases where cultural practices conflict with positions of the aid organization. For instance, gender-based provision of assistance, female genital mutilation. These are the tops of options. And I know that both of you have probably encountered issues like this at some point in your careers. And I'd like to generally hear your ideas there, because of course there's no one answer.
Well, there clearly is no one answer. It's a huge topic. And again, organizations may do things differently. So it doesn't relate to research, just to be clear about this now. There are many ethical issues besides research in humanitarian organizations. And even the ERB, we have been involved in discussions of some of those because it's very difficult to put one's head around it. Now, it's very clear, like female genital mutilation, I mean, that's relatively an easy one in the sense of saying it's very clear the organization will not at all be involved in that. We are not involved in training people who do it because that's an issue. Some organizations do that, saying it's better they do it safely than not doing it safely. We have been involved in repair, of course, and I have been involved in, I mean, women who are suffering from incontinence due to the genital mutilation, etc. In the aftermath. In terms of programs to prevent it, that's not the role of MSF. MSF has not been doing that because this is really one thing where local organizations are so much better. You need to be from the same cultural background to be able to say to people, look, this is not fine, don't do it. You cannot come in as an outside organization to do that. So I would say there the role of MSF has been to repair things after the fact, but that's really it. I mean, that's in a very simple way. There are a lot of other ethical issues. Abortion is one. Where MSF has taken a clear stance, very different from any other humanitarian organization, also having the privilege of being very independent from donor monies. So that gives us, MSF, the privilege to be able to take a very clear stance and say, yes, We support abortion rights and carry it out whenever possible. So, but these are all questions you need to discuss. So it's very good in a humanitarian organization if you have a forum where the ethical issues, the operational ethical issues can be discussed. And of course, some of the people who are familiar with discussing ethical issues who may be on ethics review board could be involved in that. So that's my short answers. Somebody else was just saying, is the ERB also involved in data integrity and quality assurance monitoring? Well, we are, but I would say in a second role in making sure that you have the data monitoring board, that you have the quality assurance, etc., in place. It's not the ERB itself who does it. So that's just brief answer.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I can just add on that question about when there are opposing values, just say in terms of provision of services. I agree with what Doris says. I think I want to go back again. This is the topic of the entire course, track credits that I teach. I want to make a distinction between ethics and accountability, and I think it's important for people to understand that, and we can talk about it for hours and hours. But going back to this example is that if the values that you have or your organization has in terms of services that they're going to provide, let's just say termination of pregnancy or like, underage marriage or this and that or sexual reproductive health, these are probably going to be things that mostly people are going to have like differences in terms of, or human rights stuff that, in terms of values. There are things that you can live with it. That's just the reality. It's like, okay, you can take this one, but not that one. So you got to know your own limit and your organizational limit. There are some values that you can let go, and there are others that you can't. And sometimes you can negotiate. That's just the reality. And then, a community has got sometimes certain way of looking at the specific, program. You can modify them, see if you get to the point that you are trying to get. And they are kind of like, and there are differences between the community leaders and the community. So they agree with you, but they can't really convince the community. So they help you to really find the common ground. So again, dig into it and discuss it and be transparent and then find the solution. Sometimes you can give something and then, advocate for something else. And there are, times that there is a specific things you just can't do. And that's fine. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who need humanitarian assistance. You don't have to be in a country A and a region A. You can go in country B and region B, and there's some other organization that they don't have the specific your values, and they always show up. It's not an end of the world. It's just the way that it is. And there are most of the time the communities always they balance between the things they can get and some of the values that they're not okay with it. So I think it's just an ongoing discussion. One thing that I want you not to do, and I think this is a problem that I personally, in my career faced, and I see a lot of people face, is that I would love to really make a lot of delegation of the decisions, whether in terms of research ethics or different type of, ethical component of the programs, delegate that to the field level. And the field means that where the two sides of a story, they actually have a close contact to each other. So the providers and the beneficiaries. That's how people understand where they're coming from. And avoid from looking at a bunch of people sitting in ivory towers. That's not what I mean, but other places that they may know context from other places, but not necessarily, they haven't been, in practice or they're not there. They should not necessarily be prescriptive in terms of telling you, oh, this is what you're supposed to do. Because again, you're coming from a different way of looking at things. The risks and perception of the risk is going to change when you're coming from a peripheral and direct to the point of a person who is sitting in an office in New York. And then I think you got to have a procedure in order to give some autonomy and also be open to say, okay, fine, and accept the risk, organizational risk for it. That will be very difficult to run a humanitarian organization and not accepting the risk. It's just counterintuitive.
I want to say thank you so much to both of you. This has been enormously interesting for me, especially, but I know for all of our people here. A special thanks to you, Dr. Schopper, for joining us. And of course, Ramin, I'm glad to see you again. But Dr. Schopper, I'm very happy to get to hear from you and to meet you. Our next webinar will be in a month, March 19th, We'll be hearing from Dr. Rebecca Walker and Dr. David DeGrazia from here at GW on ethics of animal research, which is, of course, also a complicated issue in very different ways. Our bioethics forum here, our hybrid meeting locally here, we do have remote participation as well. We have one March 4th and another one April 1st. The one on March 4th is on ethics of AI in public health, law, and society. And on April 1st, we're going to focus on clinical ethics consultation. We're having our research days here on March 28th. So here's a call for abstracts for any of you who are local. And we have a summer institute. I know, Dr. Shopper, you probably have many of these same things on your own in your own institute, in your own ivory tower, right? And this is June 2nd through 13th. And then finally, this website here under additional resources is where you can find this webinar, which is being recorded later, and then links to all of our past webinars and our future webinars. For those GW students who are seeking PE credit, please send your activity forms to the email at the bottom of the screen here. And one big thanks to Dr. Ascari and Dr. Shopper. It's been wonderful spending an hour with you. I'd love to spend 2 or 3 more hours. Thanks so much. Okay.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot. Thank you.
Thank you all.